Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. I'm Robert Castanello. I produce the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast, and I'm on the editorial board of the Florida Historical Quarterly. I want to thank all of our listeners who found the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook and joined our group. If you have not done so, please come to our Facebook page. We look forward to hearing from you. I was also glad to catch up with a number of you at the Florida Historical Society meeting in Jacksonville in May. Look out for other opportunities to meet up with the staff of the Florida Historical Quarterly. This is the podcast for the spring 2011 issue of the Quarterly, and this issue is a special issue devoted to literature in Florida. The issue features an introduction by Maurice O'Sullivan and contributions by Catherine Seidel, Jesus Mendez, Philip Levy, and Rebecca Sharpless. Professor Seidel's article is titled A Boy and His Fawn, Parallel Animals in a Trip to Florida for Health and Sport and the Yearling. Professor Mendez's contribution is titled From Adventure Travel to Leisure Tourism, The Florida Letters of William Drysdale in the New York Times, 1884 to 1893. And Professor Levy's article is titled The Most Exotic of Our Cities, Race, Place, Writing, and George Allen England's Key West. This podcast will feature an interview with Rebecca Sharpless, who is an associate professor of history at Texas Christian University, and her article is titled The Servants and Miss Rawlings, Martha Mickens and African American Life at Cross Creek. Dr. Connie Lester, editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly, caught up with Dr. Sharpless over the phone and provided us with the following interview. We hope you enjoy it.
My name is Connie Lester. I'm the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Rebecca Sharpless. Dr. Sharpless is an associate professor of history at Texas Christian University, where she teaches and researches U.S. women's history, particularly in the South. She's the author of two books, Cooking in Other Women's Kitchens, which is about domestic workers in the South, and Fertile Ground, Narrow Choices, which is a book about Texas women on cotton farms in the first half of the 20th century. She has also been the director of Baylor University's Institute of Oral History and past president of the Oral History Association. Welcome.
Thank you.
You wrote an article for the spring issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly, and that issue focused on Florida writers. Your article stands out from the others because you looked at the home life of Marjorie Kennan Rawlings' Cross Creek Farm and the relationship between the author and the African Americans who worked for her, particularly Martha Mickens. In other work, you dealt with Adela Parker, who was Rawlings' sometimes cook, and Parker wrote her own account of events at Cross Creek. I think our listeners who may be familiar with Adela Parker in particular would wonder, how did you become interested in Martha Mickens?
I got interested in Martha Mickens because she was an integral part of life at Cross Creek for at least 20 years, depending on how you read it, at least 20 years, maybe 30 or 40 years, and she was certainly an intimate part of Rawlings' everyday existence. It's a little vague about exactly when Mickens and Rawlings became acquainted, but clearly by the late 1930s, Martha Mickens was an everyday fixture in Rawlings' life. And I got interested in Parker in the book on domestic worker cooks that I was working on, and Mickens just kept turning up in Rawlings' descriptions at every turn. Clearly, she mattered a great deal to Marjorie Rawlings, and Marjorie Rawlings to her. So it's a very complicated relationship in those Jim Crow days in the South.
When you're teasing out the history of rural women, it's always a challenge to be able to talk about them individually. How did you approach your research on Martha Mickens? And in that regard, what advice would you have for people who are dealing with this kind of history and trying to uncover the life of people like Martha who didn't leave diaries and letters?
It's a big challenge and takes a lot of patience, for one thing, and a lot of luck. It's, as you know, from working on the lives of women, so many times there's just no sources there to write from. And Mickens was literate, but just barely. And as far as I know, there's nothing in existence that she wrote in her own hand. So what you have to do is to read what other people have written about this individual, and in Mickens' case, it was quite a bit. As I said, she turned up a lot in Rawlings' daily correspondence. She is a little bit in Cross Creek and Cross Creek Cookery, the published memoirs by Rawlings about life on the farm. But Rawlings was a voluminous letter writer, and Mickens is in almost every letter, certainly every letter when Rawlings was in Florida, Mickens' family, and learned a great deal from Martha Mickens. There are a couple of things in the files at Cross Creek themselves. They've done a nice job of keeping letters and documents there. And so there are a couple of short interviews, for example, with the granddaughter. And there are photographs at the University of Florida libraries in the archives. That's where Rawlings' papers are. So you really have to go at it kind of sideways. And as I say, there's a lot of luck involved because Martha Mickens could just as easily have not been included in all of these things. There are a lot of African Americans who worked at Cross Creek, only their first names. And they weren't there at a year when the census was taken, so they don't show up there. They didn't stay long. So, when I write about them, I just say, all we know is that her name was Beatrice and her nickname was Geechee, and I don't have any idea what her last name was.
I can see that it's a real challenge, and sort of reading against the grain can help you uncover these the histories of people like Martha.
Absolutely.
The article is titled "The Servants and Mrs. Rawlings," and that suggests a power relationship in which Marjorie Rawlings exerts control, even if she acts benevolently at times. But to me, as I read the article, there seemed to be strong hints of rural mutuality in the relationship between Marjorie and Martha. Do you think this was the case?
Yes and no. Mickens knew a lot that Rawlings needed. She knew how to grow things. She knew how to tend chickens. And Rawlings desperately needed what she, Mickens, had. On the other hand, Rawlings owned the land. Rawlings controlled the wages. Rawlings controlled the housing. And at any point, she could have turned the Mickens family out. She didn't, but she could have. And so there's always that kind of power relationship there. No question the Mickenses were very poor. I think one of the interesting things is that in the tenant house, the Mickenses had half of it, and there would be anywhere from 4 to 8 people living in half a house at any one time, whereas Adela Parker lived in the back half, and so she had as much space for her individual self as the Mickenses had for a whole family. And it sets up a really odd dynamic, too, between the African Americans there, because even though Rawlings loved Mickens very much, she wasn't always as generous with them as she might have been. And so it created some tension between the African Americans, which is very interesting. So rural mutuality, yes, but I think the financial dynamics are always at play. Maybe I'm cynical about that.
You were a past president of the Oral History Association. Would you talk briefly about that organization and the field of oral history?
Absolutely. The Oral History Association is a wonderful, warm organization of people who like to listen to other people. And the work that they do varies across time and across space. And basically, you can do oral history on any topic as long as there's someone who's still alive who can say, I was there, and I saw it, and I touched it, and I smelled it, and I felt it. Of course, that wall moves every day. We're getting fewer and fewer people today, for example, who remember the Great Depression. But for anybody who's worked in history, and I'd say the last two-thirds of the 20th century, it's absolutely invaluable. For example, from one of my colleagues has a student right now who is in Panama interviewing cartoonists who worked against the Noriega regime in the 1980s. And that seems so odd to us, and at the same time, if you're interested in Panamanian politics of the 1980s, as this student is, those are living sources. They are people who were actually there, they lived through it, and they will be incredibly strong sources for her in thinking about the last days of the Noriega regime. So it takes some courage to do oral history because you have to call up people or send them letters, and then you have to go talk to them, which historians are not always real good at. We prefer our sources to be more tame than that. We like them to be quiet and sitting in libraries where we can go visit them when we want to. But absolutely, for 20th century history, there is no other source like it.
Can you explain to us also how oral history is used broadly in research projects and how it's come into its own in some ways?
Yeah, well, I'm a historian, of course, so I tend to think of oral history as being a great source for what happened in the past. But other people use it for a variety of topics. It's pretty interdisciplinary. There's folklore, which is telling stories and collecting the old tales. There are literary sources, certainly political sorts of things. And yes, it certainly has come into its own in the last 40 years. The historical profession, after, let's call it the late 19th century, went through this real scientific sort of movement where they would say, it must be written in a document. If it is not written in a document, then I do not believe it. And there was always a lot of pushback against that. Not very many historians actually ever believed it, but this whole idea that we could be objective and that we could just gather up all the facts and then we would know what the truth with a capital T was. Well, pushback against that started almost right away, but in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, there was a move toward what was called social history. For those of us who grew up in the 60s, I'll call it, the history that we learned at schools was mostly generals and governors and presidents who at that point were all white men. And in the 60s and 70s, people who weren't necessarily white and weren't necessarily male started looking at history and saying, wait a minute, where are the people like me in there? Where do I come into this? And then you start looking for sources to write that history, and as you and I discussed earlier, the sources aren't always there in the archives. For example, the farm women that I studied, most of them could read and write, but A, they were incredibly busy and didn't take time to keep diaries and things like that. B, they lived in small spaces and couldn't necessarily keep letters and correspondence. And C, they didn't think they were really important, so they didn't save stuff. So when you start looking at people like farm women and say, how am I going to write this, then the answer is you have to go ask them. Say, what was it like? Tell me about that. Teach me what life was like when you were a little girl. And that's where oral history really, really shines, and it's hard to replace.
Thank you. That's a wonderful testimony to the importance of oral history. And we appreciate your interview today, and I know our listeners will want to read your article.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the opportunity to publish with you in the Florida Historical Quarterly. It's been a fun process of working with you, and I really, really appreciate it. I also am incredibly grateful for the reception that I have received from folks in Florida. The people at Cross Creek have been extremely nice to me, and at the University of Florida Smathers Libraries. So I have had a very, very positive experience in working with Florida history, and thanks for letting a Texan interlope into your state.
It was our pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is a peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the Quarterly are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast, and you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Go to http:// myfloridahistory.org for further details.